Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, everyone, and welcome to CIGA's second Ramadan series, Conversation with History. Today is April 17th, which is also the fifth day of Ramadan, and I'm very pleased and really honored to have with us a dear friend, an eminent scholar, a renowned human rights advocate, and a celebrated legal and geopolitical expert with an illustrious career in academia, international law, advocacy, and activism. Is, of course, Professor Richard Falk. Professor Falk was for many years a professor at Princeton University of International Law. He was also on the faculty of many other universities and institutions. Between 2008 and 2014, he served as the UN Special Rapporteur on Israeli violations of human rights in occupied Palestine. He is also the co-author of many studies on Palestine and many other issues that we will try to explore today in our conversation with him. He also just published his political memoir, which I'm very eager to read. I haven't got my copy yet, but I'm looking forward to get my copy. Joining me today as a co-host is Professor Nader Hashemi from the University of Denver. Nader is the director of the Center for Middle East Studies and an associate professor of Middle East and Islamic politics at the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies at the University of Denver. He's also an eminent scholar in many topics, particularly in Islamic politics and the Middle East, as well as on democracy, human rights, secularism, and so on and so forth. He has, of course, many publications on that. Welcome, Professor Falk. Good to see you.
Thank you, Sammy. So good to be with you, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Great. And thank you, Nader, for being with us.
The pleasure is all mine.
Great. I want to start, Professor Falk, by asking you about your early life. You were born at a very critical time, 1930, and this is the time where there was a lot of changes in the world. And we saw also the World War II and what happened in Europe. And of course, you were born from a Jewish family as a Jewish in America. How was it? How was it as to be a Jew in America in the 1930s and then the 1940s? How was your early life? How would you describe it? And of course, you went to the most eminent universities, all Ivy League schools in your bachelor, master's, and PhD, University of Pennsylvania, Yale, and Harvard. So tell us about this period of your life.
It was a complicated period. The economic depression was very much part of everyone's life at that period. And although I grew up in a kind of middle-class setting, there was that pressure from an economic crisis. And following that came World War II, when I was just beginning to be conscious of what was going on outside the confines of my own family life. And but interestingly, even though there were lots of Jews living on the west side of Manhattan, where I lived as a child for the first really 20 years of my life, I grew up in an atmosphere where it was really quite irrelevant to my development, I think, partly because my parents were not only non-religious, they were quite hostile to what one might call cultural Judaism or social Judaism. And so they were really more part of a broader American social landscape, so to speak.
Very assimilated.
Yeah, well, more than even assimilated, because they didn't want to be something other than what they were. It wasn't a matter of hiding being Jewish, but it was a matter that they felt they were living in a kind of post-religious atmosphere, and that my father, more than my mother, was somewhat humanistic in his outreach, though very conservative and very nationalistic, and was expert on the Japanese Navy, wrote books on the Navy, and really had what I felt later to be a kind of regressive influence on my political understanding, because he was an opponent of FDR, the New Deal, even though his first employer was a law firm in which Roosevelt was part of that law firm. And my father, they shared an interest in the Navy, and Roosevelt actually wrote the foreword to my father's book, which was a biography of an admiral, kind of adventuresome admiral. And that was his real love throughout his life. You know, so like some people never get over being a star athlete in high school or college. He never got over being on an admiral's staff in World War I. And that was kind of peak experience for him.
So your family goes back generations in the US, is that right?
My mother was born in Japan, actually, because her parents were in a business that was in Tokyo, London, and New York. And there were three brothers, and they rotated every 5 years, and she happened to be born in the Japanese cycle in Yokohama. Foreigners were not allowed to live in Tokyo at that time. And it was a coincidence that my father was an expert on Japanese Navy and predicted World War II, really. He wrote a book called From Perry to Pearl Harbor, which was anticipated the clash between the US and Japan. And it was a interesting atmosphere. I guess it was also a troubling atmosphere for me, as I try to describe a little bit in the memoir. I had a sister who was mentally disturbed from childhood, my only sibling. It was older than I was, but very much cast a sort of shadow over the family experience. And my parents became divorced when I was very young, and I later discovered that my mother and father married only on condition they not have children. So I'm only here by the grace of not maintaining the pledge. My mother was a star tennis player. She was a nationally ranked tennis player for 15 years, and really didn't want to be a mother. I mean, it was just not in her sensibility. So,
did you face discrimination while growing up in that neighborhood, or did you feel like you were part of the neighborhood and there was nothing really to fear of your ethnic heritage?
No, there was not. That kind of anti-Semitism didn't exist in this sort of middle class Central Park. It was on Central Park West, very near where the Lincoln Center is now in New York City. And if anything, there was a kind of Jewish hegemony in that part of Manhattan. And so I was not, I felt no, I went to because of my father's naval obsession, he sent me to a naval academy for summer school, a summer camp, so-called. And there I experienced a kind of mild version of anti-Semitism. But because I was a pretty good athlete as a kid, it didn't really, it didn't rub off very much.
In the next few minutes for this segment, if you tell us about why you chose the career in law. Obviously, you went through economics, and then obviously, as I said, in Ivy League schools. What shaped your opinions? What shaped you, your values? Who influenced you in that during that period?
Well, of course, my father was a lawyer, not very content with what being a lawyer meant. And because of this troubled family context, I was very slow, I think, to achieve my own identity, and law school was sort of a default option. I didn't know what to do when I finished the Wharton School at Penn, and I didn't think of myself as enough of an intellectual to get a PhD. So I did what many people do in the US, I think, when they don't know what to do, and especially if they have parents that are in the law, they just go to law school to give themselves 3 more years to figure out who they are and what they can and want to do. And I fall in that category. And I sort of knew I didn't want to be the kind of lawyer my father was. He was part of a small Wall Street law firm. I didn't want to do that. And I was fortunate to be at Yale Law School, which sort of was appealing to people that wanted sort of unconventional legal careers.
Mm.
So despite the appeal, 90% of the students did go to Wall Street.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Nader.
Richard, as you came into your formative years as a young man, as a university student, looking back, who influenced you intellectually and politically? I mean, you're coming of age in the post-World War II era. It's the beginning of the Cold War. You come from an American Jewish background. The state of Israel is sort of a big event. But I'm just wondering, if someone were to ask that question of me, who influenced me growing up, I would say Richard Falk, Noam Chomsky, Edward Said, Iqbal Ahmed. Who are the equivalent figures in your early formative days as you were trying to understand the world around you?
Well, first of all, my early formative days were much later than for most people because of this arrested development, maybe what one might call prolonged adolescence intellectually. I did have the benefit of some very powerful teachers as a undergraduate at Penn, not in the Wharton School, but in more in the humanities. I had a wonderful professor of religious thought that influenced me quite a bit because I was maybe deprived is the word, of any kind of religious or spiritual experience as a child. I became very interested in world religions, including Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam, as I evolved. And then at law school, I was trying to find those that were not interested in law on the law faculty, and that took a bit of imagination. But international law, in a certain way, is a non-legal legal subject. Mm-hmm. And they had a very charismatic figure that was teaching there named Myers McDougall, who influenced lots of people that all over the world, actually, that came under his influence. And he co-taught with the most famous social scientist of that era, Harold Lasswell, mm-hmm. who influenced, who developed many different fields. So that was a really strong, direct, I wouldn't say mentoring exactly, but influential encounter with a way of thinking about law. And even though they were conservative and sort of Cold War oriented, I took their framework, but made it serve my values and outlook.
Just one quick follow-up, Sammy. I guess the question I'm trying to get at is who influenced you intellectually in terms of your dissident political positions that you ended up taking with respect to the Vietnam War, with respect to U.S. foreign policy? I mean, the last answer to the question sort of hinted at that, but you developed a reputation at Princeton as being sort of the gadfly in the room, the dissident who sort of took the unpopular position with respect to, you know, U.S. foreign policy writ large. Is there any figure, book, you know, group of friends that sort of influenced you in that dissident trajectory?
I think when I left Yale and went to teach initially at Ohio State University in the Midwest, there was quite a strong group of progressive PhD students and young faculty that did exert an influence. No one that you would no names among them that you would recognize. And then when I went to in the middle of my period of teaching at Ohio State, I went to Harvard and got a doctoral degree. It was partly a so-called fellowship for young law teachers. And there I became very close to an Egyptian named George Abisab, who emerged as the most prominent third world international legal specialist. And we became really intimate friends, and he influenced me. He was the first one that made me see that there was another narrative to the Israel-Palestine conflict than the one I was exposed to, but not terribly interested. I was never very, I never would have dreamed of being a Zionist, for instance. And my father was an anti-Zionist. So I had that kind of background. And then there was also at Harvard that year a man named Saul Mendelowitz, who I worked with in later years, who was a kind of advocate of world order and world order thinking. And that influenced me a lot in the trajectory of my later work. At Harvard, I followed this interest in religion and took several courses from the most celebrated theologian of that era, Paul Tillich, who was, and that was a really good experience for me. And I had the opportunity to take John Rawls's course on justice, the nature of justice. And that year at Harvard was also helpful in overcoming the handicaps of my retarded youth. And so as I say, I think I really began to articulate a more progressive understanding of American foreign policy and of some of the conflictual issues in the world while I was at Ohio State for these 6 years, from 55 to 61, before I came to Princeton. Although I didn't write about that. I never would have been given this position at Princeton had I articulated my more progressive views earlier. In other words, the gatekeepers didn't do their job with me. And it's notable that if you look at the leading universities, there are very few people like me at any of these top universities.
Right. You and Edward Said were the exceptions.
So we were the exception, and Chomsky at MIT.
Right.
But he was in a different field, you know, in linguistics. He wouldn't have gotten a tenured position if he had been
vocal.
In his work was only what he did politically later on.
Right. Tell us about that period when you got into Princeton. This was a very lively period. You know, you have the rivalry between the Soviet Union and the United States. They have the nuclear proliferation. You have the Vietnam War. You have the civil rights movement. You have so many things going on. So how did you choose which issues you want to get engaged in, and how? Tell us about the life of an academic during that time.
Well, Princeton was one of the sort of centers of Cold War strategic thinking. And I was attached to the Center of International Studies there, which had some of the leading people, either as permanent faculty or as visitors that came. And so I was exposed to what one might call hardcore Cold War outlook, and that somewhat challenged me. But by then I had what might be called a more normative outlook on the study of international politics. And Princeton had no law school, so I shifted the center of my interest from international law to international relations, and what some people call world order studies. But I kept this normative edge, which was at odds with the political realism that dominated both the profession and the discipline, and was what Washington was looking for at that time. And many of my colleagues became important consultants to the government in that period, and wrote along the lines that you read. If you had read Foreign Affairs or at that time, this was the Cold War consensus that existed at Princeton. But I arrived there not comfortable with that way of thinking.
But you got involved in the nuclear issue very early, and you wrote several volumes, I believe, on that.
Yes, and that came from my earlier period of study at Harvard, and my just existential concern with the risks posed by nuclear weapons and the horror of the use of atomic bombs at the end of World War II. I really thought that was a primary challenge, and I became friends in that period with some progressive people like Mark Raskin and Richard Barnett, who started the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, which was a kind of counter-establishment think tank that brought together progressive people. And so I was quite quickly identified as a anti-war person in the Princeton context. But there was enough academic freedom, or maybe one would call it institutional self-confidence, that wasn't really a red line. You could be opposed to the Vietnam War and still be seen as an acceptable member of the faculty. I did begin to cross a red line when I talked toward the end of the war about the criminal character of the involvement. It was all right to criticize it from a quasi-realist point of view, but to stigmatize those that enacted the policy, that was considered to be a taboo, and to challenge the legitimacy of the establishment. I got in a big fight with the Council on Foreign Relations at the end of the war over the appointment of William Bundy as the editor, the new editor of Foreign Affairs. And that it was an interesting little psychodrama, because it put me in tension with David Rockefeller, who was the president of the council, and offered Bundy the job at halftime in the Harvard-Yale football game, it was the epitome of the old boys net at work, and it caused a big furor in the Council on Foreign Relations, which is a big...
So Richard, Vietnam was the first, I guess, non-Western country that you became deeply engaged with. You ended up traveling there. Is that correct? Is the Vietnam War the first sort of foray when you started to really sort of get engaged with non-Western societies to try and understand the impact of, Western policy, or were there other causes that sort of preceded your engagement with the Vietnam War? Because then it led to, of course, I think your engagement with the Middle East. I'm just trying to understand the connections.
Well, I was an early opponent of apartheid in South Africa, and in fact had gone to South Africa as an official observer of a major political trial just before I went to North Vietnam in 1968. And but what affected me in Vietnam was the experience of understanding this kind of war against a less developed society fought with high technology weaponry against a country that couldn't defend itself. It was a peasant society that was completely vulnerable to this kind of predatory geopolitics, validated very superficially by ideas like the domino effect, and where in Vietnam it was clear that one was engaged in doing what the French failed to do, that is, win a colonial war. And it was this sense that the flow of history was turning against the colonial system, and that the US was playing essentially a colonial role in South Vietnam. That was, I first was critical of it from a almost realist point of view, that this was an imprudent use of American resources, power, and the sacrifice of lives, sort of a Kenanist or Morgenthau kind of objection to the war. But when I went there, it became an experiential, transformative event for me, and I identified with the vulnerable, and that has been a theme that persisted later on in other contexts, and most notably, of course, in the Palestinian struggle for basic rights. And really, if I look back, in the memoir tries to do that a little bit, it came out of my distaste for the rich part of my family. I had my family was divided in two parts, and I liked the poor part, and I didn't like very much the richer part. And so from even then as a kid, I sort of intuitively identified with what looked like the less privileged and less powerful part of my childhood environment.
Great. Sammy, I'll keep going until you tell me to stop. So did you want to ask the next question?
Yes, go ahead.
So I'm interested in your engagement with the Middle East. Is it correct that the Iranian Revolution was the first sort of serious engagement that you had with the Middle East? Then it was Lebanon and the Palestinians, or do I have that out of sequence?
No, I think that is right, because Iran came to me as a sequel to Vietnam. There were 45,000 American troops in Iran at the time. The US intervention in 1953 had overthrown a democratically elected leader who was antagonistic to the West because he tried to expropriate the oil. I mean, he did nationalize the oil industry, and that even though the intervention was sort of justified in Cold War terms, it was as motivated by kind of resource, energy, geopolitics as it was by ideological and strategic considerations. And the Iran experience was started with students who sort of persuaded me to become chair of a committee on human rights in Iran. Mm-hmm. And because this committee was one of the few things that took a visible interest in Iran, we had speakers during the early stages of the Iranian Revolution, and Princeton, oddly enough, became a place where Iranian developments were seen received much more prominence than probably any other university, including universities with large detachments of Iranian students. And because of this visibility, I was invited by Mehdi Barzagan to come to Iran to understand the revolution in 1978.
He was the prime minister at the time, wasn't he?
Well, that was before the Shah was still in power. And
so this is before. He was opposition.
He became the sort of interim, I forget whether he was interim president or...
First prime minister.
He was prime minister. He was a very lovely man, and but he invited me and asked if I would bring two other people, a delegation of two other people, and I persuaded Ramsey Clark, who I had known from my anti-war Vietnam experience, and Philip Luce, who was he was a more religiously oriented anti-war activist, and the three of us went and had the opportunity to meet Khomeini in Paris on the return, which was a very interesting time because it was the day before he left for Iran. He was still in Paris, but he was very, very well prepared to ask us questions. Quite
What did he ask? I'm interested. What did he ask?
Well, he was preoccupied with whether there was a possibility of the U.S. accepting the outcome of the revolution. That was his primary concern. He was deeply worried by the prospect of a repetition of 1953. And he asked a lot of quite detailed questions about that. We then got the opportunity to ask him about what his vision was for the new Iran and how he saw his own role. And he gave an extremely interesting set of answers, including that he welcomed the end of the revolution because he wanted to resume a religious life. He only entered politics, in his words, because there was a river of blood between the Shah and the people of Iran.
Interesting.
No one has adequately
mentioned
whether that was he really felt that, or when he went back to Iran, he discovered he was much more popular than he had understood, or that young mullahs had pushed him toward assuming a political role, or he became disappointed with the Banu Sadra and the more secular people that were trying to run.
What's your best guess, Richard? What's your best guess?
My guess is a combination of these things. I think that he did go back to Qom when he returned to Iran, but there was many people had thought incorrectly that he was the face of the revolution, but not the core of its leadership, and that the succession to the Shah would be a kind of repetition of the Mossadegh sort of semi-secular, maybe some somewhat more Islamic character, but not of the sort that emerged and was obvious at the end of the revolution, where it was clear that the Islamic dimensions were dominant, and
he tried to pass a message to the U.S. administration through you at the time?
To some extent. No, he didn't do that. Actually, the Vietnamese did that when I went to Vietnam in 1968. But no, he didn't really do that. I was friends with Banisadra when he was in exile from Paris. And the second time I went to Iran during the hostage crisis, he was then president, but in a kind of embattled role. He had been talked of as this Khomeini's not blood son, but sort of politically
adopted.
Yeah, but they had Khomeini was very shrewd politically and knew how to read the somehow the play of forces. He had that kind of quality of intuitive understanding of power, and he often restrained some of the revolutionary forces because he saw it was too early or it wouldn't work, or he's a very interesting figure. There's an excellent biography of him by the head of the BBC Persian division or Iranian division that really captures this quality of, on the one hand, being completely otherworldly, and on the other hand, understanding the world better than the most sophisticated practitioners of political life.
Very interesting, very interesting. Now, you got, you're an academic, you're also an activist, you're going around the world. How was it to be an activist and academic at the same time? Did that put you in hot water sometimes with some people, your colleagues? Of course, I can identify with that very much, but I wanted to go get to
you have more to say than I do about that. Faculty don't, by and large, my colleagues didn't like it, but students, if they respected you and didn't feel you were biased in your evaluation of their work, I think they accepted my idea that taking your own ideas seriously enough to act upon them is a virtue rather than a vice, and that engaged citizenship seems to me to be one that has to involve acting as well as thinking and feeling. And so I never really encountered criticism or resistance from students. I did have a lot of both sarcastic and hostile reactions from faculty colleagues.
What about the administration, university administration?
Well, I happened to be a tennis friend of the president, and that was, he didn't like it, but he didn't, I had a sufficiently credible sort of scholarly profile that it was difficult to challenge me without being overtly political. And there's, as I said, in these institutions with self-confidence, there's a reluctance to undermine academic freedom directly. They'll do it indirectly. And that's what the gatekeepers are supposed to do is to keep people out so they don't have to deal with people like me once they're inside the gates, once they pass through the gates.
I want to ask you before I turn it to Nader about this observation, and I would like to get your reflections on it. A lot of people think that American universities are liberal. They're trying to push a liberal agenda, but when you are in it, you will find that it's really quite conservative when it comes to political issues. That, you know, the professors, the faculty, certainly the administration are not at the forefront of issues where people are in the streets, whether it was Vietnam, whether it was Iraq, whether it was, you know, certainly Palestine and other issues, that you find that change is very slow among faculty. There are some pioneers, certainly. There are some university faculty that you can point that these are the ones who are on the front line, but most others are not that much progressive. What do you think about this observation, and why do you think that is?
Well, my cocktail party faculty is liberal, or predominantly liberal, not aggressive.
Not social issues, of course. I'm talking about geopolitical issues, not the social issues.
No, I'm talking about the geopolitical issues. The center of gravity politically is quite liberal, but epistemologically it's very conservative. And by that I mean what passes for useful knowledge is much more, there was much more opposition to me because of my being overtly normative than being aligning myself with politically unpopular causes. And that may seem strange. I don't know if Nader has different experience with this, but certainly my experience at Princeton was one where my politics was looked upon with a certain kind of sarcastic indifference, but my epistemological or my scholarly work was looked upon as irrelevant or not really contributing to the development of useful knowledge.
There's so many things I want to ask you, Richard, but I'm going to go back to something you addressed earlier and sort of draw you out a little bit. One of the things that drew me as a young undergraduate student to your writings was your deep interest in recognition in the positive role that religion and religious politics can play in global affairs, particularly in struggles for social justice. I mean, the time when you were writing about this, was the era of, secular politics, particularly, a deep secular rigidity among forces of the political left. The idea that somehow religion in the public sphere, and you started, one of the earliest, you started writing about this in the context of the Iranian Revolution very sympathetically, but then you wrote about religion and politics. You wrote, I think sympathetically in a much more nuanced way than anyone else was very early on in terms of trying to rethink some secular assumptions about the world. You wrote a book on religion and humane governance. And so you've alluded to the impetus of that sensitivity, coming from, the courses that you took and sort of perhaps rejecting your relationship with your dad to a certain extent. So I think that resonated in my own sort of upbringing because I was deeply interested in religion and politics. I was very uncomfortable by the reigning sort of secular consensus that existed in the courses that I took and the people that I was engaged with, particularly in activist politics. So I wanted to, first of all, acknowledge that as being sort of an important contribution that you made. As you know, subsequently, you've been attacked, I think, quite disingenuously for your sympathetic view of religion and politics, particularly in the context of the Iranian Revolution. but I think in many ways you were ahead of the game in terms of understanding the powerful role that religion plays in particularly non-Western societies that are not as secular as many of our friends in the academy and in activist circles would like it to be. So I was wondering if you had any more thoughts to share about, you know, your engagement with religion and politics and its connection to global affairs. Anything that you haven't said already, because it's something that I found deeply valuable as I was trying to think through these issues, and I benefited immensely from your early attempt to sort of look at the topic from a nuanced perspective. So if I could draw you out in that direction to say something more on this particular theme, I would appreciate it very much.
No, I'm very glad you raised that, because it really was probably as significant an explanation of my marginalization at a place like Princeton, as was what I talked about, the normativity. I think it was also this feeling of relevance of religion and the potential of religion to be a positive, transformative force that was really an unacceptable form of dissent from the prevailing way that my colleagues felt about these kind of issues. And therefore, it was, I mean, if you look at mainstream geopolitics through, let's say, a Kissinger optic, he hated morality and religion and law. He hated the normativity of morality and law, and says as much. He said that his advisors always annoyed him by bringing up legal and moral questions. He talks in this book, his large book on diplomacy, and this hostility to religion, which is really part, I think, of the normative consciousness, and it's a part of the normative consciousness which, as you say, has enormously powerful leverage in many societies in the world. And the Iranian experience was my first direct contact with that as as a real, it was the only time I've really touched the live tissue of revolution in this early period, the day we were in Iran and in Tehran, the days just after the Shah abdicated, and before the disunity and the tensions of the movement that overthrew him began to surface. It surfaced very quickly, but in those few days, it was quite extraordinary to experience so directly this sense of a culminating victory with ideas and spiritual commitments, and not with guns or tanks. And you know, it was a time when the Iranians in the streets were putting flowers in the
right, and rice, yes.
Yeah, and say, but others were saying, leaders, give us weapons, because the Shah's forces were killing people and using a lot of brutality that was supported by Carter and Brzezinski at that time. Carter made the famous phone call from the Camp David negotiations with Israel, Egypt. He made this phone call congratulating the Shah for shooting unarmed demonstrators in Jaleh Square, something the Iranians, you Nada probably knows this better than I, but the Iranians were very affected by that. And Brzezinski was I mean, he really wanted a repetition of 1953. And during the hostage crisis, I was told by the head guy in the State Department, U.S. State Department, on the Iran desk, that Brzezinski would rather see the hostages dead than see Andrew Young get credit for their release. You know, because at one point, if you remember, Khomeini said he would look with favor if an African American came and negotiated with him for the release. And Young actually asked me to come with him if he went, but he said he would only go if he got a green light from the White House.
Mm.
And that never came, so we never went.
I want to switch gears a bit about the Westphalian model of international system. I know you have strong opinions there, and I'm very interested to know more. You know, you were critical of the nation state, and you, I think in more than one occasion, thought that the future is going to be the dismantlement of such system. But we know also nationalism is so strong, and that nation state system is getting strengthened. But with globalization, it got a little bit weakened. Now we're back to this nativistic type attitudes. First of all, what are your thoughts on the nation state system? And secondly, how do you see the future of that? Because that's a very important question when it comes to these artificial borders that were drawn in the midst of the Muslim world.
Yes, no, and I've been very interested in that very issue. My views have always been sort of probably confused and somewhat contradictory, because I felt very strongly supportive of the principle of self-determination and opposed to intervention. And in that sense, I felt that sovereignty and nationalism really was the historical force that brought the colonial system to an end. So that nationalism can either have if it's in the hands of the weak, it's positive. If it's in the hands of the strong, it's exploitative and oppressive. And so that the geopolitical nationalism of the sort the US exemplifies is a regressive force, but the resistance to it, which is based on nationalist sentiments and mobilization, which many countries, I think, learned from the West in some ways, at least initially, is often a positive force. But then you come to the other set of issues exemplified by something like climate change, where the state system is dysfunctional in relation to problem solving, and where the combination of national interests, the aggregation of national interests, really doesn't doesn't respond to the global challenges in a effective and sustainable way. And the UN was constituted so as to to preserve the primacy of geopolitics.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, it can't override the wishes of the P5 on important issues.
Actually, it's P1, but
yeah, it becomes generally P1, but it was partly constructed that way because of the Soviet pressure. They didn't want to be outvoted and subject to UN authority in a Western-dominated institution.
But you wrote about world government. You know, I tie this into what did you mean by that, and how could that even happen?
Well, I think I'm misunderstood. I've never been an advocate of world government. I felt it's a Western idea that would be hegemonic if it was ever actualized. It had no political traction in the non-Western world. but I favored some stronger mechanisms for the promotion of global interests. And I favored a different form of global governance that was not government. That, in that sense, again, I felt that nationalism was needed, at least for the foreseeable future, as a way of creating some source of resistance against those that had the economic and military power. And I think one of the things that has happened that hasn't been sufficiently understood is that military superiority has lost its historical agency. If you look at how the wars came out, I mean, Vietnam was, to me, a kind of learning experience in that way, that the US completely dominated the battlefield and yet lost the war. And see,
same in Iraq, same in Afghanistan.
Exactly. And so, but the elite can't learn that lesson because the bureaucracy has been militarized through these decades of a kind of permanent war footing. That
so before we move to the next segment, so what do you think we could do to pressure this bureaucracy? Even President Eisenhower was complaining in his last address about this entrenched military-industrial complex. What can you do? And you've been an anti-war for all your life. Now, after all these years, what do you think people should do? You know, what kind of actions could actually could they embark upon so that they can make a difference?
Well, it's of course a mystifying challenge why we put up with gun culture to begin with within the society. See, and I've had the idea recently that if you got a really strong repeal of the Second Amendment kind of movement, it would spill over into a kind of anti-militarism and a better understanding of how, you can learn a lot from China as well as trying to oppose them in a new Cold War. And one of the things you can learn was that they had this spectacular economic rise because they didn't become a militarily expansionist society, and they invested very skillfully in the development of an industrial economy and then a post-industrial economy. And it's a very good book by Deepak Nair on Asian resurgence, which really shows that it was not the ideology that differentiated China, but really the way in which the state and society interacted for the development, for rapid development that was sustainable and would deal with social issues as well as bring profits to the entrepreneurial class. You know, and China lifted over 300 million people out of poverty in a very short time, something the Western capitalist countries have been unable to do for over centuries.
Nader?
So Sami, should we shift to the Arab Spring and to sort of questions related to Palestine, democracy, and
our last 15 minutes here.
15 minutes. I was going to ask you how much time we have. So, Richard, we would benefit from, your reflections on the state of politics in the Middle East, primarily in the Arab world, 10 years after the Arab Spring. Exactly 10 years ago at this moment, there was a huge amount of elation, optimism that perhaps the paradigm of political authoritarianism had been broken, that we were seeing the dawn of a new era, and looking back over the last 10 years, It's only Tunisia that struggles on, and there's something to, to celebrate. But the rest of the region has sunk into deeper despair, deeper authoritarianism, deeper sort of, a repression of societies. And of course, the plight of the Palestinians in many ways sort of embodies this. And so I guess the question really is, what are the lessons of this last 10 years post-Arab Spring? And, looking forward, what are some of the challenges that I guess that confront all of us who, hope for a better, more prosperous, more democratic Arab world? What shifts need to take place? In what way can U.S. foreign policy be engaged with to try and make these types of changes? I mean, I just gave a talk the other day on Joe Biden's Middle East foreign policy, and there's not a lot to admire there, with the exception of, the Iran nuclear deal, trying to restart that. It's really the Obama policy revisited. So, if you could share with us your insights on really the broader struggle. I think the Arab Spring for me really was the struggle for, societies against deeply repressive regimes, many of them, but not all, backed by the West. And how do you get out of this dark period? And I guess one way you get out of the dark period is to try and learn the lessons of sort of what went right, but also what went wrong, and how, and what can we learn from this very dark, last decade?
Well, those are very, very cogently phrased questions and inquiry. And I did have the opportunity, because Israel didn't allow me to enter during the time the 6 years I was special rapporteur on Palestine. I spent a lot of time in the Arab world during this very period, and shared the excitement of those that saw what was happening during the period of the Arab Spring itself, and especially Egypt, which I think was crucial, both in terms of being the most dramatic movement, and also the place where the most formidable counter-revolution occurred. And I think one place to start responding to your questions is to contrast what happened in Egypt with what happened in Iran after the revolution. See, the Egyptian movement never saw itself in what one might call faced with the Leninist dilemma, that if you really want to make a revolutionary transformation, you can't rely on the old elite to shape the transition. And this movement, which was admired partly because it had no program and no leadership, was very unwilling to challenge the old political elites that held on to the bureaucracy and made it possible for this counter-revolution to occur with important psychological help from Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the US. I mean, I'm not sure what would have happened without this kind of nervous, and Saudi Arabia was particularly at first quite surprising to me, because
and the Emirates.
That what?
The United Arab Emirates also were part of this.
I was a friend of somebody he was the first foreign minister after the Egyptian revolution. He was not a member of the Muslim Brotherhood himself, and in fact was part of the sort of secular Cairo elite, had been the UN ambassador for Egypt in New York during the Mubarak period.
Amr Musa?
What? Who? No, not Amr, but just like him. I'm blocking on his name, though. I knew him for many, many years, and he's, as far as I know, still active. But
Nabil Fahmy, maybe.
Yes. And when I was in Cairo, he had just come back from the Gulf trying to reassure the Saudis and the other Gulf elites that this revolution wouldn't imperil their interests, and that the Muslim Brotherhood would not be more than 30% in free elections. And there was a complete misunderstanding of the distribution of power and belief within the society, because these Cairo middle classes all thought the whole country was like they were. And that was proven wrong in the elections, first for the legislative elections and later in the national elections. And there was the unwillingness to really try to establish a new political structure in Egypt, first of all. And I think if it had been done in Egypt, there would have been a regional effect, just as the Tunisian and Egyptian revolutions caused these other uprisings in Yemen and Syria and Bahrain and elsewhere. So I think that there was something missing in the revolutionary process, that it was almost destined to fail. And I remember the Turkish leader, Erdogan, went to Cairo and said to the Muslim Brotherhood, don't take power. Stay away from the center of power at this point, because you'll be blamed for the failure after the West tries to isolate and diminish the results through economic, mainly economic means. So I think that the major lesson, or one major lesson, is that if you're challenging a authoritarian structure, you have to be willing to have an alternative model of political governance, and that you can't rely on the good faith of the bureaucracy and the armed forces. The armed forces also were extremely important, all trained in the US and sort of uncomfortable with the prospect of a democratic society. So that unless you displace those old centers of power, they will reassert themselves.
How can you displace them peacefully, Richard?
Well, it depends. See, it happened in Iran by and large. I mean, there were Lenin's famous statement, again, you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs.
Right.
And I think there is that tragic dilemma that you either will fail in the political struggle, or you have to adopt some of the practices that you oppose to displace the old order, because you don't succeed merely by throwing out the head of state.
Mm-hmm, of course.
If the Iranians had stopped when the Shah abdicated and said, okay, now relied on Bakhtiar and a kind of supposed secular liberalism, there would be no Iran today. The Shah would have been, or his son would have been back in a decade.
Very good point. I want to just, in the few minutes remaining, turn it to Palestine. You've been all your life, you've been an advocate for justice in Palestine. You've taken some missions. You've been the special rapporteur for 6 years on human rights. How do you see the end of this conflict coming?
I wish I had the clearer crystal ball.
What I meant is, do you see anything that, positive? I mean, you've been an observer since the beginning. Do you see anything positive coming out, or are we coming to the point where all the different political solutions are totally closed, and that there is going to be a violent eruption of hostilities? Or what exactly do you see?
Well, I think there is a lot of uncertainty both in the surrounding area, in the Arab world, and within the conflict itself. Because one of the things, what Israelis are haunted by at the present, which I think is important for those that are sympathetic with the Palestinian struggle to understand, they're haunted by the South African experience, where South Africa was in total control. The white supremacists were in total control of the society, and apparently were unthreatened. Yet the global solidarity movement, combined with the African resistance efforts to make the country less governable, isolated the country sufficiently that the white elite recalculated their interests and decided they'd be better off with a multiracial constitutionalism than they would be trying to survive as a pariah state. I think the Palestinians are, despite everything, winning what I call the legitimacy war. And the ICC recent decision about investigating Israeli war crimes, the general growth of the BDS movement, the fact that B'Tselem, the leading Israeli human rights organization, came with a strong report saying this is an apartheid regime, not just in the occupied territories, but in Israel itself. Those are all, I think, very influential, symbolic victories for the Palestinian struggle. And what I was trying to say earlier about Vietnam applies here, that most of the struggles, if they persist, that are won in the symbolic domain of politics, not on the bloody battlefields that superior weaponry control.
So you're optimistic about this, it seems to me.
Well, yes, to the extent, see, I always have taken the position that we're not smart enough to be optimistic or pessimistic, and therefore we should keep struggling for what we believe in.
Mm-hmm.
And I really think that's most of the big changes that have come in my life have come as surprises to the experts.
Right,
You know,
right.
From
Yes.
the end of the Cold War to the end of the South African regime to the Arab Spring itself, all those things came in defiance of what the so-called experts anticipated.
Before we go to the last question, I just want to announce to everybody that CIGA is organizing its second Palestine conference, and that Richard would be the keynote speaker, one of the keynote speakers on the first day, which will be June 18th. Stay tuned. All right, our last question, briefly, Nader.
Well, I think this last question is in many ways the most important question for you, Richard. And it's the following question. How do you stay so young at the age of 90, intellectually, politically? How do you continue? I mean, it's a serious question. It's not rhetorical. I mean, is it? I know you were very active as a young man playing sports. I think you're benefiting from that. But is there a special diet you consume? Do you do yoga? Do you meditate? I mean, we all aspire to be as intellectually vibrant and productive as you are at the age of 90. Any insight you can share with us on that topic would be hugely beneficial.
I wish I had an insight. I don't do any of the things that you're supposed to do. I think I probably did inherit a pretty good genetic. My mother may not have given me love, but she gave me a good genetic legacy. And I think that staying engaged with what you believe in is something that does allow you to keep a certain kind of vibrancy in your mental life. And I think good luck plays, luck plays a part. I do feel very fortunate that I've managed to survive in relatively what seems like good shape. Everything's contingent, of course, in life, but so far so good.
Thank you so much, Richard, for this very rich conversation. I really enjoyed it. Thank you, Nader, for being part of it.
Thank
as
you.
well. And
Well,
I hope to hold
thank
both
you
of you
both.
again.
Thank you both for a wonderful conversation.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you. And I am looking forward for future events as well, where we can host both of you. Our next conversation is going to be tomorrow, and it will involve, we talked about the Iranian Revolution today, and we'll probably talk about it more tomorrow. It will be Professor Muhammad Marandi from the University of Tehran. And with me will be my colleague, Awais Khan, who is a senior research associate here. Thank you very much, everybody, and hope to see you again tomorrow. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.